Я почну українською, потім продовжу англійською. Так як казав, розмова наша буде англійською мовою, тому якщо хтось не розуміє, у нас там є приклади для перекладу. І саме з цієї причини питання я прошу задавати в мікрофон, якщо будуть питання, і треба буде виключати, вимкнути приклад, щоб не створювати їх для наших перекладачів. Це технічні такі. Технічний початок, зауваження, так. Mayhill вже краще знає українську за мене, це не секрет. Гаразд. I'm switching to English. This is my honor and pleasure to introduce my friend and also a very good professor from the Stetson University in Florida, United States, Mayhill Fowler. Who is a big friend of the Center for Urban History, and today we gathered to celebrate this publication, the book which we awaited and which finally arrived this year, called Beau Monde. In Ukrainian we usually say Beau Monde, I don't know the French exactly. On the empire's edge, на краю імперії, Beau Monde на краю імперії, сцена і I would say it in Ukrainian, Stetson і держава в радянській Україні. Mayhill Fowler is a professor at Stetson University, as I mentioned. She received BA at Yale University, and then she studied, she continued her study as a PhD student at Princeton University, and she graduated under supervision of Stephen Kotkin, a knowledge historian of Stalinism, and actually thanks to Princeton, I think also, Mayhill got involved in Soviet history and Ukrainian history. Since she was a practicing performer and active theater goer, she also decided to work on the theatrical history or history of cultural milieus in the Soviet Union and the specific territory, which is in this book often described as Southwest or Yugo-Zapad. As we all know, in Ukraine, the state railway still has the title Південно-Західна залізниця, which reflects actually not the actual geographical positioning of Ukrainian railway, but rather the view from Moscow. Південно-Західна залізниця так виглядає з Москви. So Mayhill writes about this south from the perspective of Moscow, but it's not less important, even though it's on the periphery. This periphery influenced heavily the center, and this is the story which is unfolded in this book. We will have the procedure that Mayhill will show us certain pictures and tell us a very interesting story about this book and the story which is inside this book, and then we will continue with several questions, and then we'll open the floor for others to give questions or put questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Bogdan. Thank you to Sofia Diak za zaproszenie. Thank you to Irina Matsavko for organizing this pretty. And thank you to Wojciech Szymulewicz for reading the book and agreeing to talk with me about it. Thank you also to all of you for being here and listening to this talk. This is a very special place for me intellectually. I was a stipendiatka here a really long time ago. I kind of hate to count the years. I was very, very lucky to get a strange postdoctoral fellowship here, and I was part of the Collectives for a while and taught a class at UKU. And it was really during that time and in conversations with many of the people sitting here in this room that I really was able to move a very baggy and big idea, but chaotic dissertation into the book that you see here today. So it's really special to be able to present the finished product many, many years later, at this place that has been really important to me for my kind of developing my thinking on the issue of culture and culture in Ukraine. So I'm going to present the book in about 30 minutes or so. I practiced in my Airbnb and it was about 30 minutes, so we'll hope that that's true. I'm going to focus on the two major arguments in the book, and I'll explain to you how I lay them out through the chapters of the book. And if you're interested in something in particular, we can pick that up in the discussion section. But I wanted to make sure that I really covered kind of what I wanted to do in the book, in the talk. So I have two main arguments coming from two sets of questions that I had about theater in the Soviet Union. As many of you know, I used to be an actress myself. I trained in Conservatory, Theatrical Institute, and I worked for several years as an actor in New York City. Rather, I was a waitress in New York City, and I worked for Regional. And when I started really looking at Soviet culture seriously, none of the books that I read about Soviet theater really spoke to my own experience założnikami, right? They didn't really connect with what I felt I knew to be true about the world of the theater. And so that was the book I wanted to write. And I was particularly interested in two big questions. So the first one, let's start with the book's title. So Beau Monde on Empire's Edge, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine. So let's start with this first issue, the Beau Monde and the state and the stage. So really, what was the relation between artists and the state in the Soviet Union? Why was it so specific? Why were artists so important? And why did the state care so much? Right? And Beau Monde is a concept that I'm using to really break this binary of state and stage. There's this myth that I'm sure many of you know that payet v России больше чем poet, which is a lovely idea, and leads to this idea of this sort of binarness, a binariness about the artist versus the state, the artist fighting the state. And there's a lot of really great literature sort of working through how a certain artist, Shostakovich, Mayhill, Malevich, how they compromised with the state, worked with the state, fought against the state, were in opposition to the state, were a dissident, weren't a dissident, were a dissident in one period and then not a dissident in another period. And that's really less interesting to me than the nature of the relationship between the state and the arts on a larger level, how it evolved and its consequences. Because the level of engagement on the part of the state towards artists was very specific to the Soviet Union. And that's what I was really interested in. So not just seeing artists and state, but really what exactly was the sort of crossover and interrelationship between the two. And this relationship came from the imperial period, right? The people creating a cultural infrastructure in the early Soviet Union grew up in the Russian Empire. Many of them tried to be artists in the Russian Empire. And it was hard to be an artist in the Russian Empire. There were a lot of challenges. So artists who had struggled in the Russian Empire, once there was a new system, they really tried to bring the state into the arts for financial support, guaranteeing audiences, enacting artistic agendas. Artists were not protected from the market in the Russian Empire. There are tons of memoirs you can read where theater artists get stranded by some entrepreneur who leaves them in the snow in Irkutsk, and they have no money. There was very little sort of state accountability and state support, pitrinka, for artists in the Russian Empire. And so in the early Soviet period, artists worked really hard to make the state accountable. And they were very successful in that. They made the state accountable, getting a lot of resources from the state for the arts. And no one, of course, foresaw the consequences, that eventually then artists would be accountable to the state. Also in the imperial period, artists were not part of high society. If you performed on stage, you could not have rank, you could not have chin. So again, early Soviet artists, by drawing the state into the arts, getting these resources, by joining the state themselves in many positions of importance, managed to raise the social position of the artist. So artists from Moscow to Vladivostok, including Kharkiv, were some of the most privileged members of Soviet society. Central apartments, nice vacations, status in the general public, and that's really very, very different from elsewhere. It's a real marker of difference between the Soviet Union and, say, the United States, for example. So on the one hand, we see this kind of relationship between artists and officials creating extraordinary artistic output, right? The money that the state puts into the arts is extraordinary for budinki and buildings and rehearsal space and costumes and tons of new plays every year, every season. And in that sense, artists got what they wanted, right? They were part of the state, they got resources. But there's a flip side, right? So the state demands fulfilling the plan. And can creativity happen po planu? Can it happen on schedule? If the arts are supported by the state in a monopoly, can they fulfill the function of speaking not for the state, but for the general audience? Right? So those are questions that this infrastructure raises. And I think this creative toll ultimately taken on artists has created a myth of sort of the noble Soviet martyr artist. And there's some truth in that myth, right? Like all cliches, there's some truth there. Archival documents clearly show officialdom forced artists to denounce their fellow artists, sent artists to the gulag, shot artists in basements and in the woods and in the forest. But the relationship between the artist and the state, as those same archival documents show, was more multidimensional and far more interesting. The state spent an enormous amount of time and money and paper on artists. And the relationship between the arts and the state, as I'm trying to show in this book, was one of the peculiarities of the Soviet Union. And so this sort of world of artists and officials circulating together, making this infrastructure, is the Beau Monde of the book's title. And I track the emergence of this Soviet Beau Monde in two stages. And the first is the literary fair, Theatrical, which, as many of you know, was the name of a journal produced during Soviet Ukraine's artistic golden age, the 1920s, and later used in a memoir by Yuri Smolich to summon up the entire world of the 1920s. So he kind of uses this idea of this journal was this world of the 1920s. And then I trace how this Literaturny Yarmarak became official artists, so artists that were very much part of the state, and arts officials, so chinovniki, officials who were tasked with managing the arts. A Beau Monde, but one very much part of the state. And this concept of the Beau Monde might be jarring. One of my readers of the manuscript said, I really don't like the term Beau Monde. Can the author rethink that term? That's the response I want. I think this idea of Beau Monde conjures up sort of an image of, artists sitting in some Parisian cafe, smoking Gauloise with wine, or people talking about politics in a London coffee shop, or enjoying elegant concerts on landed estates. But that's sort of the point that the Montmartre, the Parisian cafe, the London coffee shop, none of that existed in the Soviet Union. Those conversations are happening, but they're happening in the Politburo, they're happening in the Central Committee, they're happening in state-supported editorial offices, state-owned apartments, right? State-owned sanatoria. That's where those discussions about art are happening. So this sort of over-engagement with the arts by the state was one of my research focuses, and I try to show that really this is not two separate worlds, but one world, one Beau Monde. Okay, I'm really moving slides now. Okay, so the second set of questions, Empire's Edge, Soviet Ukraine. So the second part is the sort of Ukrainian part of Soviet Ukrainian theater. So in other regional fields of study, it's really been accepted that culture is constructed, right? Scholars don't talk about some sort of primordial French culture, right? They talk about how, in Eugene Weber's terms, peasants became Frenchmen, right? Or, how in, as France became a colonial empire, how French culture changed, how in decolonization that changed the idea of French culture. In other words, the idea of French culture is not something assumed, but an analytic problem to be examined and discussed. And I wanted to take that idea and kind of think about Ukrainian culture and Soviet Ukrainian culture in that way, as something constructed, right? It's not an objective category. I don't think there's something that is sort of an primordial Ukrainian culture, but rather many stakeholders, agents, audiences, officials, artists negotiate, construct, struggle to create something that is Soviet Ukrainian culture. And this focus on cultural construction, culture as constructed, suggests, I think, a slightly different interpretation of Soviet nationality policy. There's generally a very clear chronology that we follow, which is that there's Korenizatsiya, which is really good, because yay Ukraine, and yay Ukrainians, and yay Ukrainian language. So we get this Korenizatsiya, and then we get great art, and then that sort of scares the Russians, and then we get Russifikatsiya, right? And then everything good is destroyed. And being very general and sort of generalizing, but that's generally the kind of chronology that we see when we talk about culture in Soviet Ukraine. And there's truth in that interpretation. Again, like all cliches, there's truth there. But I think this idea of Korenizatsiya all good, Russifikatsiya all bad, ignores two huge factors. And the first is the reality of deep internal dissent as to what was Soviet and Ukrainian and Soviet Ukrainian culture. It ignores the fact that not everyone agreed on what that was going to look like. Not everyone agreed who should have a say in what that was going to look like. And you could read many memoranda and meetings where, again, people who are really all part of the Rozsтрелянное Відродження are disagreeing with each other, right, about what this culture is going to look like. So this internal dissent, I think, is really, really important. And also the larger story of the rise of Moscow, which I'll touch on in a sec. So the people at the heart of my book were the men of Korenizatsiya, right? These are people who created and rode the wave of cultural explosion in Ukraine and in Ukrainian. But actually, Korenizatsiya was a challenge for them. These policies reinforced ethnic separation, which is actually kind of hard for people who'd grown up in such a multi-ethnic place to sort of separate what was Ukrainian from Russian, from Polish, from Jewish. And secondly, Korenizatsiya assumes that there is something that is Ukrainian culture. And in fact, what was Ukrainian culture was precisely what people were trying to decide, right? So it assumed something, and actually that assumed thing, Ukrainian culture, is what was up for contestation. So how, for example, would urban, modern Ukrainian culture differ from urban and modern Polish culture, or Jewish culture, or Russian culture? Who got to decide what Soviet Ukrainian theater would look and sound like? Kurbas, Yuran, Terashchenko, Vasilko, the Politburo? Did playwrights? Did the audience? And interestingly, few scholars, I think, have focused on the multi-ethnic and constructed quality of Soviet culture itself, right? So we often talk about the constituent cultures of the Soviet Union as these sort of concrete and unquestioned categories, that there is something that is Georgian culture or Uzbek culture, and that can't be the case. And indeed, for the Soviet Ukrainian Beau Monde, this task of creating culture that was Soviet, but that was also somehow Ukrainian, was a massive challenge. I worked a lot with historians of science who look at the construction of knowledge and how local and imperial networks facilitated the spread and construction of scientific knowledge. And I also built a lot on work by Serhii Kelchik, who restores agency to indigenous elites in the creation of Soviet Ukrainian culture. And also, in a different geographic context, Adib Khalid, who shows how local actors made use of the Soviet socialist project actually to create Uzbek culture, modern Uzbek culture. So looking at Ukrainian culture as constructed also, I think, allows us to step back and see a larger story of what I call cultural topography. And by that I mean not just geography, but how places acquire importance in relation to other places. How do places become centers and how do places become peripheries? Because actually, in the late imperial period, Moscow wasn't the end-all be-all for theater. It was a big city. There was a lot of money there. There was a lot of old believer merchants with money who wanted to fund the arts, but it wasn't the only city. Kiev was important. Tbilisi was important. Riga was important. St. Petersburg, right? There are a lot of cities that were really important for theater. And what's interesting is you see over the 20s and 30s, Moscow becoming this mecca and becoming really the center, right? And so I think that sort of how that happened is really important. And actually, I have told this story about how a couple years ago, I went to do research in Moscow, and I met my former theater history teacher. I'd known him in the 90s, and he was like, oh, that's so great, you're writing a PhD on Soviet theater, that's fascinating, what are you writing about? And I told him, and he was like, Дорогая, что случилось? Like, what happened to you that you're studying these Ukrainians? You know? And I was like, but they're so important, they're so interesting, their work is so good. So why did he have that reaction, right? How did that happen that if you just Googled Soviet theater, nothing about anything outside of Moscow would come up? Why is that, right? I think that's something that needs to be explained. And I was really interested in how that happened and looking at transnational methodologies, right, which are very hip and sexy right now. But I think there's a lot on sort of the Soviet Union and the non-Soviet space, and I'm really much more interested in the internal dynamics inside the Soviet Union. If we think of these different cultural spheres inside the Soviet Union, how do they interact with each other? Okay, so how do I do all this big conceptual stuff? So I wanted to do this through narrative. I wanted to write a book that was interesting to read. I hope it is. So I did it through collective biography. And what I did was I put my Soviet Ukrainian artists in pairs. So with an artist who is kind of generally more famous in the Soviet culture field. And this does two things. So one is it deprovincializes Soviet Ukraine, right? It puts Kulish on the same level as Bulgakov, it puts Kurbas on the same level as Mikhails, it puts them in that pantheon. And it also sort of makes them Soviet, right? It sort of reminds us that these were Soviet artists. And they weren't kind of in a completely separate category. They were part of this Soviet artistic community. So I start with Mykola Kulish and Mikhail Bulgakov and this sort of rise of the literary fair. And I talk about the play Patetichna Sonata as a response by Kulish to Days of the Turbans, which he hated. I can go into that more. And so Patetichna Sonata, Sonata Patetique, was not produced in Soviet Ukraine. They said no. But Kulish got it translated, and it was produced at Tayurov's Kamerny Theatre in Moscow. And it had a pretty good run. Friedrich Wolf loved it, translated it into German, Die Beethoven-Stücke. I think Budioni went and really liked it. It got decent reviews. Then Kaganovich shut it down, and the play was closed. So what is that, right? Is this a Soviet Ukrainian story? No, because it was produced in Moscow. Is it a Moscow story? No, because it came from Soviet Ukraine. So really, I think through this
the story of this play, I'm trying to talk about this internal transnationalism. So then I have Ostap Vishnya and Ilf Petrov, and the challenge of Soviet entertainment, which was a really big challenge, right? So a lot of artists, really didn't want to talk about entertaining the public. They really wanted to make great art with a capital A. But I think what's interesting about Kurbas and the Berezil Theater in particular is he really took on this challenge, and he spoke and wrote a lot about trying to make culture for the street. And at his theater, there was a lot of comedy. They did the Mikado. Mykola Kulish wrote some really funny plays. They really focused on trying to reach the audience, and they did this play, exclamation point, which is the first Ukrainian language sort of estrada show, which was an attempt to make popular Soviet Ukrainian culture and deal with this issue of publika, the audience. This is one of my favorite photos. It's the Berezil Theater performing in 1923. The photo was taken by an actor, we don't know who, from the stage. And I sort of look at this as like, this was the problem, right? There's a hala publica, like what do you do with these people? And this is a challenge. But interestingly, the Berezil really tried to deal with it. And in this chapter, I deal with this city. When the Soviets entered Lviv in 1939, they brought a lot of cultural infrastructure with them, but there was one thing they didn't have: entertainment. So they actually hired Polish, generally Jewish, refugee artists, and in those 2 years we have some really interesting stories about, like we see here, Heinrich Var's orchestra. We have the incredibly fascinating story of Irina Yarosevich, who became Renata Bogdanska, who became Irina Andersova when she married General Anders. This is actually from the interwar period. Total side note, like actually a footnote in the book, but we're here in Lviv, so there was urban popular culture in Ukrainian here in the interwar period. This is a picture of this ensemble. Many of you may know Bogdan Veselovsky, Kosanatolsky, Yablonsky. They created a little jazz quartet, and they had a star singer who was dating Veselovsky, Irina Yarosevich, and there was Ukrainian jazz in Polish Lviv. The ensemble was gone by the time the Soviets arrived for various reasons. But the point is, it's interesting to look across the border and see, well, in interwar Poland there was popular urban Ukrainian culture, so why wasn't there in Soviet Ukraine? And then of course that's a problem for the Soviets when they come here, right? They have to somehow make entertainment. They have Kornichuk, they have no jazz. Okay, so then I talk about the official artist through the case of Les Kurbas and Solomon Mikhoyls. They're very similar. They're both non-Russian minority artists who become very successful, but they're very different too. Kurbas went as high as you could possibly go because he was in a republic. Mikhoyl's theater was the only non-Russian language theater that was managed союзного подчинения, so at the union level. There's also a really interesting myth about them both making Mikhoyl's famous Lear. It's actually not true. They probably talked about Lear, but actually they were not rehearsing that play when Kurbas was staying with Mikhoyls in Moscow. Long story, I can get into that more in the Q&A. And in this chapter, I look at this production of Ivan Mikitenko's Diktatura, which Kurbas did in 1930, as a way of showing how he took even a very sort of basic propaganda play, and through his theatrical techniques made a really extraordinary theatrical experience. Then I have a chapter on a very important figure, the чиновник-мистецтв, arts officials. And these are people who I think aren't discussed a lot, right? We have a lot of talk about how artists are oppressed, but not about the people oppressing them, right? And what their story is. And when you read a bunch of these archival documents, the names come up, and you can find out who these people were. And I use this category, arts official, intentionally. There's a lot of work now on networks, marriage, and patronage, which is really important. But what's really interesting in the Soviet period is that there were people whose job it was to manage the arts. So I look at the case of Andrei Khvilya, who was a wannabe writer, never really became a writer, but he managed artists. And it was his job, 9 to 5, to deal with budgets and allocation and meet with artists and explain who's going to do what repertory and who gets what money and who goes on what tour, advocate for them in Moscow, etc. And in this chapter, I also discuss the theater of collectivization, actually, and a production by Kurbas of a play written by Mykola Kulish, Makalena Grasa, which is clearly a play referencing famine in the countryside, right, that we now call the Holodomor, a play that was shut down. And we have a reference to that in Spochady by Josip Hirniak, who's an actor, about how it was a rehearsal at gunpoint. The NKVDisti were there, and then they shut the show down. And again, I think the truth is a little bit more interesting when you look at it through the lens of Andrei Khvilya, who's the apparatchik in charge of this production. And you see two very different ideas of theater and what theater should be emerging. For Kulish, theater was catharsis. We're going through famine and collectivization. We should have a play about it. Theater's an agora. We should be discussing it. And Khvilya writes, this play is upsetting. It's going to upset the audience. You can't talk about socialism this way. It's upsetting. I need to protect the audience from you, the artist, right? We need to make theater that reflects a world we want, that we aspire to have, as opposed to the world we do. Those are two very different ideas of theater, right? And I think that's a really sort of important piece of the creation of socialist realism and the Soviet theatrical infrastructure. So the final chapter sets out the new Soviet theatrical network, which includes 2 locations, the Gulag and the Kremlin. And Les Kurbas and his colleagues, as many of you may know, made theater in the camps of the Gulag. And so I follow Kurbas and Kulish in one camp, Hirniak and Vishnya in another. That the Soviet state murdered Kurbas and Kulish in November 1937 is a tragedy, and one with huge consequences for the development of theater in the Republic. But it's a tragedy not restricted to Ukrainians, but very typical of the Soviet period. And the Kremlin, interestingly, became a center of entertainment in the Soviet Union, and the best and brightest stars graced its spaces of performance. Yet the literary fair was largely not a part of this story. But my book actually doesn't end in the Kremlin. It ends in this, the afterlife of the literary fair. These legendary figures and the art they created, Kurbas, Berezil, Kulish's plays, Vishnya, they've created a rich legacy. And actually, no longer do people have to refrain from talking about them, right? People couldn't talk about them for a long time. We can now. But I think the world in which they lived and worked has faded. The context to their work, the choices that they made, the limitations and possibilities shaping their careers is increasingly lost. And my book hopes to restore their context so that we can appreciate what it was they actually did. So thank you so much for your attention and that sort of slightly longer talk. But hopefully we will have some questions and we can talk about theater and art and culture and the public and money and all of that good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayhill. Of course, not so many people in this audience had the pleasure to read your book. I had this pleasure, so I can pose my first questions to you. It's a big shift. I mean, you mentioned transnational history, but as far as I see in different audiences, the relations between subject or the lonely agent and the structure or the system is a hit idea in recent, let's say, decades, maybe 2 decades in historiography. Did you have this methodological approach in the beginning, or your documents that you encountered showed you? Because what I read in this book is a very dense relations between secret police officials and artists who are drinking together, discussing together, denounce each other, then they tell each other truths that they denounce each other, then they go to secret police, they discuss different issues. It seems really weird. And especially in the Ukrainian context, when people used to believe that the system was a kind of sturdy and anti-subject, and then these artists, as you mentioned, were fighting the system. So what was first, your methodology or your findings?
That's a great question. I think the relation between structure and agency is one of the key themes in the study of history. I think certainly for me as an actress, the individual subject, the agent, was first more important and interesting. That's how I got drawn in, right? Was the stories of Mayhill or the story of Kurbas, right? So it was through agency and biography that I got drawn in. But I think one thing you learn in graduate school is the importance of structure, and that we're all part of structures, whether we like it or not. We're all part of structures, and the key is to figure out how political, economic, social structures shape our actions and our assumptions. And in a way, that's actually what cultural history is, right? It's figuring out why things have meaning and what structures make it so that someone thinks theater is important. What structures create a situation where a state official is going to ascribe money to the arts, right? So yes, I think structures are very important, and I think that what can be hard is really restoring those structures as they were then. In other words, we often look with our own lens and our own structures on the past, right? And we have to uncover the structures that were around in the 1920s and 1930s as opposed to imposing our own. It's a little theoretical, but...
It's very good. So maybe you can trace then, in your book, in your research, what was more important for the implementation of changes? Agents, like subject, or the structure? Who made changes actually in early Soviet Ukraine?
It's always a dynamic, yes. Yeah, I think for me the structures were more important. I think when you spend a long time sitting reading a lot of archival documents and you find the connections that Bogdan is talking about. Oh, this person was this person's neighbor, this person married this person's ex-wife, this person drank at this club, this person played chess with this person, and you put these things together, you kind of uncover a bit of a structure. And I think that's really important. I think if we talk about change, I guess I would say, like, what kind of change do you mean? Like, do you mean aesthetic changes, or do you mean,
I mean
cultural infrastructure changes?
Because you talk about the imperial legacies, that we have the Russian Empire and the legacies specific to empire. And then we have the period when the Soviet Ukrainian culture is built.
Yeah.
So this is the point where I would like to find change.
So that's exactly right. So I think the structure is really important. It's important to realize there's very little state support for the arts in the Russian Empire, except for the big theaters, right? There's very little state support and help for artists. So when you sort of look at that, the lack of that structure, then it makes sense why people are writing the state a lot in 1921, 1922, right? Because they're trying to get money, they're trying to get support, they're trying to get, you know, one artist writes the GPU, secret, or so pre-NKVD secret police, in like 22 saying, can you just like deal with this other group of artists, they're performing at a Litany Sad, they're doing Khatura, it's terrible, please, like deal with them, right? And that's drawing the state in for artistic purposes. And where does that come from? It comes from a structure where the state wasn't helping them, right? So you're trying to build that structure.
Okay.
Yes.
Then my question would be, because as I understand, maybe not correctly, but your claim is that Beau Monde is this specific construct of the state agents, artists, and secret police and artists.
Insiders.
Insiders. And then what would be the difference between Bohemian culture and then Beau Monde?
So I would say there isn't really Bohemian culture in the 1920s.
So it will develop later.
It would develop. I think we would turn to your work on the 1970s.
so in the 67.
Yeah, I think you see something. This is really a book on the early period. And actually in sort of the next project I'm working on, I'm reading a lot of post-war materials. And it's really interesting how different they are, actually. And I think you're right. If we want to talk about people dropping out of the state, I sort of question that anyways in the Soviet period, but we can talk about that in the 1970s. In the 1920s, no. Yeah, no.
Because this is a very useful category. We can say that there was this Beau Monde, which is a kind of complicated unity of everything.
Yeah.
Bohemians probably were criminals, not involved in the state activities.
Well, you could talk about, then you could talk about Huligani, right? You could talk about, you know, for some reason I'm thinking about like Misha Yaponchik. You could talk about Ostap Benda. I mean, there are ways you could talk about how a concept of bohemian might have existed, but again, I think then you're imposing an idea of bohemian. What would they have thought bohemian what was, and what would that have meant to them?
Okay, then my question is crucially important, I think, for Ukrainians, because you mentioned very often in this book that these guys, they tried really to make a modern Ukrainian culture.
Yeah, for sure.
And they are stuck, because this is the problem. They have to invent or reconstruct or create this culture, and then the definitions, for instance, you use the citations from Khvelyovy, who says that this culture should be modern, urban, and excellent. There were any other elements, like ethnic, folkloric? Because what I see is that for the center, because I like very much your idea of making groups, because you show that Ilfin and Petrov, who comes from Ukrainian South,
for sure.
but then they go to Moscow to create the universal Soviet culture, and then you have Vishnya, who is remaining on the periphery, becoming the national Soviet author. So you show how different trajectories from Ukraine could develop different forms of culture. My question is about the difference. So how they perceived, what is actually the national difference?
Yeah, right? There you go. That's a problem. That's a question. What does it mean to create culture that is modern, that is urban? And both of those have a little bit of a beyond the nation quality to them, right? And excellent. And excellent in whose view, right? Khvelyovy's view probably wasn't everyone else's view. So what does that mean? And that is what they were trying to do, right? Part of it was they wanted to get out of the village, right? So they were fighting against this idea of in theater, for example, the Theatrical, who, by the way, are amazing. They're fantastic. This is not to say anything against the Theatrical. For various reasons, structural, right? All the Corifei plays had to be about the village, right? The silo. And some of them were great. Maria Zankovecka, oh my God, she's so amazing. But they're village plays. It's about the village, right? And so part of the goal was we want to make city stuff. We want miska kultura, right? We want urban culture. But if so much of what we have grown up with as Ukrainian culture was village culture, how do we make city culture, particularly when cities are multi-ethnic places, right? So how do we make Ukrainian culture bez vyshyvanek, right? What is going to be its marker? Is it language? Is it themes? I think we see some of this coming through in some of this work. I mean, in Mykola Kulisha's work, for example, Mina Mazilo, great play about what is Ukrainian culture. What is Soviet Ukrainian culture? You have Totya Motya, who's super Russian, kind of anti-Ukrainian. You have, Dechko Taras, who's like super Ukrainian. You have a bunch of people caught in the middle. And the whole play is this sort of satire, farce done with love, comedy about what is Soviet Ukrainian culture. So I think that kind of, there's a very Soviet need to identify one thing. This is the culture. This is it. Right? But actually what people engaged in that were discovering was, of course, it doesn't work like that, right? So that was a problem.
Probably my last question is about kitsch. Milan Kundera once mentioned that the possibility to make a unified culture for all people would rather be a kitschy culture, because you cannot unite everyone around the common culture.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in the 30s, under high Stalinism, the kitsch was kind of proliferating attitude to represent the socialist advancements, or as Sheva Fitzpatrick called it, the foreplay. So how it should or may look like, but not the reality.
Yeah.
Did you find in the 20s, in your period, discussions about the kitsch and the reality?
So yeah, they didn't want narodna kultura.
So the kitsch was somehow related to folk?
Yeah, related to the village folk, vyshyvanki, chopak. That was, Pobutovi, right?
And they lost.
And so, and you see this actually not just in Ukrainian culture, you see this in all of the cultures, all of the national cultures in this region. You see young Russian artists talking about haltura, we hate haltura. Young Ukrainian artists like Kurbas and the Molody Theatre talking about Pobutovi. Yeah, Pobutovi is so bad. Jewish artists in Yiddish talking about shund, right? We're trying to get away from shund. So it's really this generational thing of getting away from folk, getting away from narodnost, and getting to something modern, urban, cosmopolitan, whatever that was going to look like.
But you also show that, for instance, for Chviluvei, the mass culture is something unacceptable, and then Kurbas tries to make the popular and mass.
Well, I think that those are two very different things, right? Mass culture, how they understood mass culture is one thing, but popular culture, I think, might have been something else, right? I mean, I think Kurbas was not talking about, radio. He actually tried to make some films and didn't like it, actually, and left Vufku to go back to the theater. But he was definitely trying to make theater that was that reached a non-elite audience. I think that was very much one of his goals.
Thank you very much. Probably
Thank you.
My not related specifically to the subject of the book, but the question is about the language that you use, because I love the language you write. It's kind of light and very clear. It's not academic language, though it's very substantial and full of information. So tell me about the audience. I remember Marcy Shore once said that when I'm writing, I'm constantly thinking about the people who will read this. So for whom you written this book?
So I think that's a great question, and I think actually opens up a larger conversation for those of us who are naukowcy, who have to write books to keep our jobs. I think it's really hard. I'm sure I'm not the only one among you who finds a lot of history books really boring. And I often find that the translation just came through. That's it. Yeah, it's funny. I think sometimes I've been feeling like often the academic genre restricts the stories you can tell. And if you're writing about theater, shouldn't it be interesting? Right? It shouldn't be boring. At the same time, for scholarship, it has to be really boring and like really detailed and with a million footnotes that show like I've done my work. And I think that's a real. I think that's a problem. And I actually was very lucky to have a reader, Irina Vushko, who's a great scholar and from the city too, actually. Read one of my chapters and she just made a great comment. She was just like, "You're writing about these amazing people and like they should be interesting, you know? Like you're getting all sort of tangled up in." It was the chapter on Vishnya and Ilfin Petrov. And I was getting really tangled up on, you know, this scholar says entertainment is this, and this scholar says entertainment is this, and the topos and the language and the discourse. And I cut all of it. And I just tried to talk about Vishnya. And so there is a larger point that I'm trying to make here that I can't quite seem to make, but I've actually been thinking about it a lot and how there's often a disparity between scholarship and like readable books. And I'd love to bridge that gap, and I think that there are different ways to tell stories that have arguments and that are really important, but that also can be engaging.
Thank you very much. I just want to add that after Joshua First also, who wrote about the Ukrainian cinema, poetic cinema, this book opens up for the English-speaking audience the big world of Ukrainian theater, which is very good, and we are very happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Будь ласка, якщо в нас є запитання,
Так, і може
треба,
задати
можна українською,
англійською мовою,
але мікрофон, будь ласка. Я буду роздавати.
My name is Alexandra. I wanted to ask you about which percentage in this book is dedicated for not pedestrian, but not famous phenomena of artists for this Beau Monde, but in usual situations. In common life, which percentage of the book?
I wish more. The original dissertation had a lot more on their everyday life in Budynok Slovo, in Kharkiv, right where they lived, and in the apartments before they moved into Budynok Slovo. I had to cut a lot of that. And part of that was, again, how you write a book about theater. And how do you include enough of the aesthetic performance to show that these are really great artists, and enough of their everyday life just shows a Lashtunkami, right? So I tried to sort of balance that out, but it was very difficult.
Okay.
Питання піднімайте просто.
Thanks so much for this nice and great introduction into the book. Unfortunately, I also had no chance to read it yet.
But you will.
I really hope, really looking forward to read it. And from what you presented, I have like two questions. And one is about this idea of the age of empire. And for me it's quite interesting because, of course, I think that in the post-war period, actually, Kharkiv was rather a core of empire, not the age. And it's very interesting that in this early Soviet period, I wonder what made it like the age or province. So was it like Ukrainization made it a province, or how do you frame it? How do you really understand this like core and age and like relations between them? And my second question is about your interesting way of having these pairs of biographies. And I think this is a really great way to really to make biographies more like theoretical, to produce some kind of more generalized statement about the biography, because really this is a very challenging genre when you write a biography, not just to retell the basic facts, but to make it really contextualized and actually to go like beyond just one figure. But to me, it also, like my first allusion or my first association with that is also a very imperial and very, I would say, Soviet way of putting like these couples or these pairs of cultural figures when we are talking about, for example, like our, I know it more from different sphere, for example, Ляля Убивовк is Ukrainian Zoya Kosmodemyanska.
Right.
So we have a kind of pairs of like very great artistic figure from the center, and we have some local copy, like smaller, a little bit not so great. Yes, and all things like that. So actually, how do you struggle with that, or did you have it in mind as well, or
So those are two really great questions. So the first question about how Kharkiv sort of became edge of empire is that is what the book is about, right? And I think that's a really important story, and part of my argument is that it was the edge of the, this whole region was the southern part of the Russian Empire, but in the early Soviet period it wasn't the periphery, right? There was, I think you could say, one of the stories in the early Soviet period is the making of an artistic center, right? And certainly in the 20s there wasn't one. Kharkiv was one. Kharkiv was one of the multiple centers, right? Harsha Ram actually writes about this for Georgia as well, and talks about Georgia as a center of modernism. Again, we have Adib Khalid writing about Uzbekistan, right? And Kharkiv is right there too. So I think it was very much an artistic center. I would totally make that argument. And I think it's the rise of Moscow politically, and because politics was so engaged with the arts, that centralization politically then, of course, reflects artistically. So Moscow very much becomes a center. And what's interesting, actually, is Moscow's a very selfish center, in that part of what makes it a center is that everyone else is not the center. And you start to see that in stenograms. You don't see it in the early 20s. By the late 20s, you start to see it. In the 30s, first of all, everyone has to go to conferences in Moscow. They talk about na periferi, or periferini regioni, the peripheral regions, which is not a phrase that appears earlier. It starts to be a phrase that appears, and you start to see this positioning. For example, when theaters from the regions tour Moscow, they get evaluated there, right? And the stavlenia is very much, we are evaluating you, right? And of course, you can tell these artists are kind of like, God, we're part of Kharkiv modernism, and here we are being evaluated, in Moscow. So that's a dynamic that very much happened. And the other story, that's such a great question. I definitely think of like Pushkin and Shevchenko when you were just saying that. So it actually did not come from a Soviet idea at all. I completely see why you're sort of seeing that. And actually my intention was sort of the opposite, actually, that I really do think Kurbas rocks, and I really do think he belongs in this pantheon. He's not the lesser version of Mayhill.
You know what I mean? And so how do you do that? And I think part of it is putting them all in the same story. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say about that. Yeah, yeah.
First of all, congratulations for this accomplishment, and I'm really happy that I could be here in Lviv and listen to this real presentation and real conversation between you and Bogdan. And I have a lot of questions actually, and you can pick the one you like actually to answer, to give floor to other people. First of all, I'm really interested in resources for culture, both symbolical and material, and maybe you can answer using some kind of example from your book. What resources, maybe symbolical resources, do your heroes and heroines use to create Ukrainian culture? Actually, maybe some thematic resources, and it builds somehow on Bogdan's question about what make Ukrainian culture actually, to what references were people use to make this culture. And material resources, like asking for money, and it's always a very interesting thing, who is paying and for what who is paying, and how people ask for this money, and what kind of justifications they use to ask for this money. And two questions are more about book and creating this book. Actually, it comes from your dissertation, and I'm wondering also, what did you sacrifice to make this book out of dissertation, and maybe some kind of changes you have to make, maybe some kind of topics you have to develop to make this book available to like a wider audience. And also maybe it's a kind of provocative question, but I plan to translate it into Ukrainian as well.
Okay, so I'm realizing like I didn't bring a pen or paper, so I'm going to try to answer, and then if I forget something, just remind me. Okay. So first of all, let me take the last question, which may answer the first. So my dissertation was very Ukrainian. I didn't go to Moscow archives when I was doing dissertation research. I lived in Ukraine. It's really when I learned Ukrainian. And there was very little Moscow in the dissertation. It was much more everyday life, and there was much more Soviet Ukraine world in the dissertation. So then it became clear I needed to go to Moscow, and that's really the shift, is incorporating that, reading materials in Moscow archives and incorporating that material, right? And that's where, to go back to Irina Skolkina's question, like that's where you see in these big Moscow conferences, like that's where you start to see, I think, these changes, and sort of seeing my guys in that context, I think, was really important. I would also add, I think, timing plays a really interesting role in that. I did a summer of research in 2014, which is a really interesting summer to be a scholar of Ukraine working in Moscow. And I had this very interesting experience of being with a lot of Western scholars of culture who were very critical of doing Soviet culture and not studying figures from the center. And it was very, I sort of, you know, when you're sitting on the buses and hearing people talk about Ukraine, and my khazyaika, who's wonderful, but she was very worried I was coming to Lviv because of the Banderovцы. And there was something about that experience and reading all these Moscow archival materials that I felt like I kind of get this story a little bit more, right? What would it have been like for them to come to Moscow when they thought they were a center, and to sort of find out other people think you're a periphery. So that was a real shift in the project. Sources that they used, what I think is so interesting is I think they used a lot of contemporary sources. Kulish has a letter where he says, you know, he had a very interesting career. He was in the army, and then he was like a school inspector, and he was a party member, and
And he was in the army from 14 to 22. And he says to his good friend, I want to write about the revolution until I get it, you know, that's what I want to write about. So it was actually their experience. And I think when he writes Patheticna Sonata, it is a response to Days of the Turbans. Like, you don't get to own what this experience is. My experience is different. My experience is this, right? So I think it is that, what were they building on? They were building on their experience, which was unique to them, right? And what is sort of interesting to trace over the Soviet period is what happens to that ability to write about a unique experience versus a universal experience. What was the other question? Oh, Pereklad. Yeah, I would love to have a Pereklad. I think it's very complicated with wydawnictwa and all of that. I would love for it to exist here. I would love for it not to be on Amazon. I wish I'd brought a suitcase of books and I could sell them to you all for beers. So yes, I would love for it to exist here.
Питання Василя і потім Вірик.
Дуже дякую. Я просто вражений, направду, позитивно. Цим натиском, який я тут відчуваю, інтелектуальним, це направду неймовірно. І мої два такі маю запитання. Також подякую за те, що ти ввела дуже цікаву категорію людей, бо завжди пишуть про митців, про культуру, про мистецтво і зосереджують увагу на самих митцях. Але рівноправними гравцями на цій сцені, на цьому полі завжди є чиновники, які здійснюють керівництво. А для 20-30-х років в Радянському Союзі це ще є не тільки чиновники, які розподіляють гроші, це є ще ідеологічна цензура. І це люди, які здійснюють цю ідеологічну цензуру. А крім того, і коли вони сходяться в тому такому двобої, в цій грі, з одного боку митці, які хочуть експериментувати, які звикли експериментувати, які хочуть чогось свіжого, цікавого і так далі, а з другого боку є люди, які поставлені системою і державою не допустити того свіжого і цікавого. І якщо вони пропустять це свіже і цікаве, то тоді їх розстріляють. Тоді система отих наглядачів покарає тих людей. І моє питання полягає в тому, я дивлюся на всіх цих персонажів, вони всі загинули, їх повбивали. Або майже всіх повбивали, мається на увазі митців. В них що, не було інстинкту самозбереження? Вони не відчували, що вони загинуть, що система не пропустить, і вони далі продовжували. Звідки в них була оця воля до тих експериментів, до того свіжого і так далі, ризикуючи своїм життям?
Okay, so that's a great question. So, first of all, a question about sort of who is doing the censura. And I think this question of who is doing censura is really important in this period. Because it comes from many different places. It comes from chinovniki, for sure. It also comes from mitzi. It comes from artists themselves. And there's one meeting in particular in 1929 about dictatura, where, you know, everyone is criticizing Curvas for what he's doing, and from various different directions, and he sort of comes back and says, you are all shuleri prikarta, and you know, you don't know anything, and it's a huge scandal. And I think that's actually really important, right? One of the problems, in some sense, this is not necessarily a scholarly opinion, but Curvas was the smartest person in the room, and no one likes the smartest person in the room. So it's not just the Andrei Khvilya, the censor, it's also other directors who are like, why does this guy get all the money? Like, I want this, right? So there's a lot of this internal dissent that's really important. Sort of self-defense, why? You know? I think what's so interesting is no one saw what was coming. There's a very interesting, so while Curvas was in Nasalovkach, of course, he is observed, and those observations are reported, right, and you can read them.
And there's a conversation that a source has with Curbas, where he says, you know, I didn't get it. I was swimming against the current, and I didn't understand. I didn't understand. I understand now that here I am in the camp, but I didn't understand. And I think you see that. I mean, Kulish, he writes Magdalena Grasa. I mean, you read about Magdalena Grasa, you're like, why are you writing this play? Stop it, you know, write something different. He's at the sanatorium, I think near Kaniv, actually, when the play premieres, and he writes his former mistress, like, I hope it goes well, fingers crossed, you know, is really upset when it gets panned, still thinks he can get it translated and produced in Moscow, because that had happened before, right? And so, they really didn't, on some level, they got it. On some level, they didn't see what was coming. Vishnya, you know, Vishnya was on the list of people to be shot in November 37, and his ulcer acted up. And the people taking him to the camp where he was going to be shot were like, we can't deal with this, dropped him off at a medpunkt. And by the time his ulcer was healed, the wheels had turned and his name wasn't on the spisak anymore. So I think it's easy to look back and see like, gosh, couldn't you guys just have done something different? But I think what's so interesting is they didn't see that. And why didn't they see that? Right? And I think that's really important.
Part of my question was somewhere in the middle of what you have already said, but still I have a comment which will lead me to a question. I have been thinking earlier, and I maybe will find most of the answers in the book. Sorry if I'm not reading and asking the question. But my observation as a historian of literature is that there was a period when it was possible to discuss with the censors, and then there was a rapid change when you will never be able to persuade anybody in your writer's opinion. From the other side, at least through almost all 1920s, there was a period when people who were actors and people who were representing the system were in belief that Soviet and Ukrainian is compatible. Soviet and Uzbek is compatible, Soviet and Georgian is compatible, because those are in the making. But since a certain point, I don't know exactly where it is, maybe 1928, possibly the Stalin speech on culture in the Soviet Union, something like that. We know that, for example, Mykola Khmelyovy and Kurbas started to be suspicious from the point of view of the regime. And I observe also that for a certain period, these new cultural figures, they have different tasks, as they would call it, different artistic tasks, when they are tackling something in the village, the rural culture, and when they are tackling something in their city, the urban culture. What have I in mind? When they are doing stuff on the village, which is predominantly Ukrainian, they are asking themselves, what is Soviet about it? When they are doing something on their city, which is predominantly non-Ukrainian, they are asking themselves, what is Ukrainian about it? So the focus shifts. And after certain events, and we know more or less it's the beginning of 1930s, everything which is Korenization, already Korenized or whatever, start to be very suspicious in the eyes of Moscow. And what do you think about this moment that when they were preparing something through languages and through local cultures to become Soviet, at a certain point they discovered it should not necessarily be exactly Soviet, it could be global. And when they dared to have this higher aim, when they started to be cosmopolitan, then they were crushed by the regime. Nevertheless, the accusation was about nationalism. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your interesting commentary. I think, so
part of the issue is I do think there's a difference between literature and theater, actually. So I would certainly defer to you on questions of literature. But I don't think for theater, the distinction between village as what's Soviet about it and city as what's Ukrainian about it, it doesn't quite always match. And I'll take the example of Donbass, actually. And for example, the mines and workers, right, who are not in a kind of city situation like Kharkiv, right, but they are certainly part of the Soviet-Ukrainian project. And what's very interesting is we have a series of letters that people write, Vishnya, Khrylevi, I think Kulish, maybe Johansson, they all go to some remote mine and talk, you know, I don't know, have some sort of presentation, and then the people at the talk are writing them questions for them to answer. And it's actually a very interesting source base because it's Russian and Ukrainian and sort of a mix, and some of them want to know when is Vishnya's stuff going to be published so they can, where can they pribate, and some about, you know, who are you people and why should we care? And so you see a real sort of variety of responses that I think don't fall into neat categories. And I think we have to be really careful with this notion of Soviet. I think I do think they still believed in the possibility of a Soviet Ukraine, even with the rise of Moscow and a Soviet Ukrainian culture. And I don't think that they were suspicious of Soviet culture, they were suspicious of specific people and, say, the Kremlin. They were suspicious of Postashev, right? They're suspicious of Karl Carlson, right, who's Balitsky's deputy. They're suspicious of certain people, but I don't think they're suspicious of the project. And I actually think it's important that, you know, they remain loyal to socialism and kind of are certainly not part of the capitalist West, and really do believe that it's possible to make this thing that is Soviet Ukraine while they were doing it. And I think what's also interesting too is this puts this artists and officials in the same world. You see officials having the same issues, the same problems of we're working very hard in our obkom. Why is Postashev here telling us what to do? Why does Moscow keep writing us letters? We're trying to get grain. Why can't they stop, you know, telling us to get more grain? Why does passport exist in every language on a Soviet passport except Ukrainian, right? Why does Vufku turn into, you know, just a little Ukraine film, an affiliate, right, of the Soviet film industry, right? It's actually Kostyur who goes to Stalin, who says, you know, can we please keep Vufku? Like, it's actually a really good film industry and film studio, and we really, like, it's our thing, right? And of course, that doesn't work. So, yes, there is fear, anxiety, frustration, anger, many drunken episodes reported to the secret police about the rise of Moscow, but I don't think it's anti-Soviet. I think it's anti what seems to be happening right now, and I think that officials are very much a part of this, you know, process of a very scary realization of we're becoming a periphery, and why is that? So thank you so much, though, for your comments.
What about then Khrylevi and his European imagination?
He's communist. So yeah, sure, European imagination, but by Europe, and he means that he specifies this, Goethe, right? He's talking about specific cultural figures. He's not talking about capitalism, he's not talking about anti-Sovietness. He's talking about a specific cultural orientation towards the West and not towards Moscow. He's not talking about anti-socialism.
Чи є ще запитання? Є, Софія.
Because socialism is global, you know. Mayhill, дуже-дуже дякую. Я третій раз слухаю цю презентацію, і вона кожен раз стає мені ще більше і більше подобається, тому що вона кожен раз така сама добра, але мені подобається ще більше. І я маю два питання, і одне я позичу з питання, яке було у Києві, а тут не прозвучало. Це не було моє питання, я його просто позичу. На початку ти говориш про імперську ситуацію, imperial topography, і вона виглядає набагато більш динамічною, плинною. Театри є їдиш, російська, польська, вони, тобто актори там і там. І це таке плинне поле і інша структура багатоетнічності. У 20-х твої герої є агентами, які творять іншу структуру багатоетнічності, і вона є поділена, і ти це розповідаєш. Але вони все ще живуть у світі, який є багатомовний. Вони живуть у світі, в якому вони стикаються з людьми на вулиці, і в театрі, і за лаштунками, і в будинку, які говорять російською, польською, їдиш, you name it. Що вони про це думають? І в дивний спосіб нова інфраструктура, ця коренізація поставила митця у рамки етнічності, а поставила менеджера, цього чиновника, як людину, яка фактично бачить цей багатоетнічний світ. Тому що товариш Хвиля, в нього на столі, як ти пишеш, є просьби, листи, не знаю, доноси, ще щось від різних театрів. Українських, єврейських, польських, російських. Тобто цей ландшафт, фактично, як він зник від митців, і як так сталося, що він з'явився лише у чиновників, які, в принципі, його і менеджували доволі довго. Тобто це на початок. Тобто це перше питання, якби цей початок, this transition. А другий, це на кінці, тобто сам кінець, там, де це є legacies. Тобто з одного боку, одна категорія, яка в радянському проєкті створилася, це сильного митця, тобто митця, який може змінити світ. А друга – це чиновника. І я не знаю, що у нас з митцями, але з чиновників у нас лишилось. У нас лишилася ціла інфраструктура державного управління культурою. І з твоєї перспективи, не лише добре це чи погано, а що з цим можна зробити? Чи це є те, що викинути, чи це те, що дійсно можна з цим якось ще працювати? І це щось, що багато людей вклало в своє життя, і так як Василь казав, вони в це вірили. Тобто вони це не бачили, бо вони в це вірили. І вже, напевно, такий коментар, що ця книжка не тільки англійською мовою, вона працює в парах, і я думаю, вона принесе англомовному читачу більше розуміння і української культури, і радянської української культури, Радянського Союзу, і, напевно, загалом культури ХХ століття, але я думаю, що український переклад є не менш потрібний через те, що це зовсім інший погляд на людей, яких ми читаємо в підручниках від школи до університету і далі, і далі, тому що ми маємо дуже обмежено, тобто ми в пострадянський період вкрали від них частину їхнього життя. І це є несправедливо. Тобто це не означає виправдання, це означає нерозуміння. Тому так дуже, досить складно, що ця книжка, щоб перекласти книжку і видати в Україні книжку, це Mayhill дуже ввічливо відповіла, але це дуже печально. Тобто, що просто у нас є багато університетів, у нас немає жодного університетського видання, яке зможе перекласти книжку і видати її. Так, щоб ми просто зрозуміли і хотіли, напевно, це змінити. Питання, яке є
вкраду у Олі Мартинюк з Києва, тому що ми багато кого побачили, і Mayhill вже знає, яке я питання задам. Це є чоловічий світ. А чи це лише чоловічий світ?
Shout out to Olga Martinyuk in Kiev. So thank you for your question. So first, this multi-ethnicity. I think, again, an imperial structure, right? An imperial structure is, for a long time, you couldn't have a play in Ukrainian. And when you could, it could only be about solo, right? You couldn't have theater in Yiddish, right? So because of that, in this multi-ethnic world, people wanted to have culture in their own languages, right? So from that structure, it makes sense that, yes, these were men of Collectivization. Everything should be in its place. We should have Yiddish theater. We should have Polish theater. We should have Ukrainian theater, right? They're not, I don't think they thought of what is going to be the after effect of trying to separate everything. And what's interesting is you can't. So, yes, you see directors moving from one theater to another, actors moving from one theater to another, because they did speak many languages. You see plays happening at multiple theaters, repertory coinciding, raising the question of what is Ukrainian culture if we're all doing the same play. Is it just that it's in Ukrainian, that it's like the Ukrainian theater? Many of the technical personnel were, of many ethnicities. So it was a multi-ethnic world. And so this, how does Collectivization work in a multi-ethnic world, right? That's really the question. And, I think that issue of, certainly for Chinovniki, their Landschaft was multi-ethnic. And for any theater manager, they're constantly defending their theater in the face of other ethnic theaters. So they're seeing this multi-ethnicity. And I actually think artists are too. I think it's really hard to get at that with sources. It's really hard. But I do think they were much more aware of the multi-ethnic world they were living in than their own sources suggest, if that makes sense. Legacies. So, so as an American who is constantly worried about our own National Endowment for the Arts being shut down and not funded, I say go Chinovniki. It's great to have a state interest in the arts. But I think what's one of the legacies of the Soviet period is this issue of having to define things. So a repertory has to have 2 Russian plays, 3 classics, 2 contemporary Ukrainian plays, 1 foreign play from a bourgeois capitalist country, right? It has to follow this list. And I think that's hard to work with. But what I would say too is that one thing that strikes me about Ukraine is that people actually go to the theater here, which might seem banal, but every time I've gone to the theater in Ukraine, there's a lot of people there, and they're really different. And there's young people, and there's old people, and there's post-Soviet people, and there's hipsters, and people seem to go to the theater in a way that they don't in America. So I would say one thing that Ukraine has is a public. So it's what the Chinovniki and the Mitsi want to do with that public, but the public exists, right? There are posters just walking around Lviv today for theater plays. I challenge you to find a poster for a theater production anywhere outside New York City. Actually, there's amateur theater in my town that has posters, but that aside. There's a public here, right? So I think that's really important. And then, in some weird Freudian way, I used to be an actress, and there's like no actresses in this book. I don't know what that's about. It's a very male world. I think when I wrote the book, I was really interested in entertainment. I was interested in nationality policy. I was interested in empire. and I wasn't interested in gender. It wasn't one of the focuses of my research, and it wasn't one of the focuses of the book, and the sources supported that because there's no women in the sources. They're all hunting and like eating watermelon with quilivi and drinking a lot. There's very few women. And so obviously what seems so interesting to me now is like, where are the women? Why are there no women? What, actresses are so important, why aren't they talking about the actresses? And so actually I'm sort of taking that on in a potential next project. I'm actually working a lot on the figure of the Soviet actress and looking at Natalia Ujvi actually and kind of, you know, what was the continuity and change between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in the positioning of the actress, and what were the power structures behind the scenes for women in the arts. I'll repeat since from the Kiev talk. There's this really interesting moment in a memoir of Mikhyl's daughter, Natalia Mikhyl's, and she talks about part of Gossiet had been on tour, and they're coming back to Moscow, and so Mikhyl's daughter talks about how all the women in like the dorm where they're staying are like primping and working on their hair, and they're making pirozhki and like getting all ready for their men to come back. And it's so traditional. And these are actresses, right? But it's such a traditional image of sort of women, you know, taking care of the home and taking care of their bodies and their selves sort of for their husbands. And it's very interesting. And again, these are experimental avant-garde actresses, right? And here they are, you know, making pirozhki, right? So I think there's a lot to that. And I think one of my goals in the coming years is to rectify the lack of women in this book. So we look forward to that.
Добра нагода зупинитися на пирожках. Якщо немає запитань, то я буду дякувати від імені Центру міської історії. Thank you very much for coming.
Я тільки хотіла сказати, що ця книжка буде у нас в бібліотеці, і Mayhill дуже щедро сказала, що вийшло 5 книжок, які помандрують до бібліотек в Україні, тобто, щоб ці книжки були доступними. Ну і ми будемо робити все, щоб наша інфраструктура дозволяла книжки читати українською мовою. Так само. І велике-велике тобі спасибі за твою неймовірну працю і неймовірну, я не знаю, енергію, яку ти вкладаєш в те, щоб історія була цікавішою і кращою дисципліною. І це також трапляється на території України. Дякую тобі. Дякую.